All right, so in case you didn't hear me before, my name is Esther.
And I'm James.
And we are both technical support engineers. Our combined average tenure on the Tableau's technical support team is 2.6 years.
6 repeating.
Yes. In that time, we've answered roughly 2,145 analytics questions.
And by question, she means your guys' problems, so you're welcome.
After working with customers to find that many answers, it's fair to say that both James and I feel confident jumping in and tackling any really difficult calculation. But how do we get here?
And more importantly, how do you guys get comfortable creating and troubleshooting your own calculations?
To answer that question, I want to give you a little insight into why we decided to create the talk. When working analytics questions, I realized I followed the same steps every time I troubleshoot a calculation.
And when we compared notes, we realized that our methods, in large part, are the same.
All of us, myself, James, and other analytics specialists, tend to follow the same basic process, but we do so in this imprecise, more art than science way, which, while clearly effective, is hard to teach. The heart of this enigmatic process is creating a view in Tableau that is simple enough it becomes easy to visually understand why your calculation is wrong. The method we're presenting today crystallizes the stuff we do in technical support into 14 small, actionable steps.
Just 14.
So 14 does sound like a lot, admittedly, but that's why we put them all into a reference guide, which will be available for a total of 24 to 48 hours after conference, so you'll have that going on in the future. What are we doing today? Our agenda looks sparse, but there's a lot of content in each of these sections. And for that reason, we're going to ask that you hold on to your questions till the end of the session.
And because we likely have a wide range of skill levels out there, I'm going to start with some basics. So that's how to create a calculated field, syntax, and some concepts you want to keep in mind.
After that, I'll go over the theory of troubleshooting a calculation at a high level. But because I believe it's easier to learn something when you can see it in action, we're going to end today's session by walking through an example together. Do you want to do your question? So who here has had a chance to look at the poker tables? Anyone? Not a poker crowd. Well, James and I did. Here's a picture of us playing poker. Can you tell who's winning? In poker, there are terms for players based on their skill level. So you might call me a fish because I really have no idea what I'm doing. Whereas James would be more of a shark because he tends to come out ahead in games. In tech support, the story is a little different. As many of you probably know, there's a lot you can learn in Tableau, and new team members do so very rapidly. So when James started 6 months after me, he was still a little fish when I was already halfway to being an analytics shark. A lot of our early interactions, for that reason, were me answering James's questions. But today, we're on the same sub-team, and we help each other with our more difficult cases. I've come to rely on James for creative solutions when I feel like I've hit a brick wall. And with further ado, here's James.
Thank you, Esther. So one of our core values at Tableau is that we work as a team. And I couldn't have asked for a better team in tech support. And I couldn't have asked for a better collaborator on this. So thank you for putting up with my shit the last couple weeks.
You're welcome.
So Esther gave us an intro on what we'll be talking about and why we're here. But I want to touch on why calculations are important at all. Do you mind connecting to Sample Superstore? So this is one of our go-to data sources in tech support. It comes with the product, and it's great for practicing. You might start with a question when you connect to your data source, or begin forming questions through exploration. In this case, I might be interested in seeing a broad overview of my business's sales by location. So let's start by dragging the city dimension to the view. Oh, that's fine. My microphone's off again.
It's not off. Just speak up.
You don't want to do that the whole time. So how do we share Tableau desktop and have it on this screen.
We don't have any access. Sorry about this, folks. What we're gonna have to do is I'm gonna have to lean over and look at the view over here, so we can have a little lag in our.
Yeah. Anyway, so what is a dimension? A dimension is a categorical field. So it's a field that's used for grouping of data. Can we drag the sales measure to the view? Yeah, it's pretty. So I don't know if the tech guys know how we can share the main monitor.
You just want to duplicate?
Yeah, so it wasn't letting me do that. We were gonna share
Can
this.
you sign in?
It's a good start. Yeah, there you go. Troubleshooting presentations, she said. So you guys enjoying conference? It's good, it's fun. Vegas is like a home away from home for me, which I told that to my family the other week, and they were like, I'm pretty sure they thought I was like a degenerate gambler or something, which I'm not, I promise.
All right, thank you very much.
Perfect.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay, so a dimension is a categorical field, so it's used for grouping of data. And we dragged sales measure to the view as well. Measures are numerical, quantitative data that you expect to perform math operations on. So we have this view. Okay, quick sort. Thank you, Esther. So we have sales broken down by city, but sales alone doesn't tell us a lot about our data. It doesn't tell us which location brought in the most value, for example. So let's bring profit to the view. So we have a breakdown of sales and profit by city. We can compare these values for each location, but it doesn't tell us a lot about which city is the most efficient, for example. So if we were trying to decide which location warrants a bigger business investment, we might want a different metric, such as profit to sales ratio. Do you mind deleting the profit ratio calculation? So because our data source doesn't include profit ratio, we're going to have to create a calculated field. Yeah, so Carl Sagan has a great quote that I wanted to include here. He said, "If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, first you must invent the universe." So let's do that. Let's invent the universe, or at least create a calculated field. So what goes into a calculation? First, the fields. So it's profit to sales ratio, so profit and sales. We're going to use a division operator. In terms of operators, pretty much anything you are going to find on a calculator, you're going to find in Tableau, of course. Lastly, functions. So this list of functions is a little daunting at first, but the beauty of calculations in Tableau is that everything you need is right here in front of you. So that calculation helper can be used to select a field. It'll give you syntax, a description of the function, and an example. So let's give this thing a name.
One of the things that we do in tech support is we'll often name things with an exclamation point at the beginning. And that just sorts the calculation at the beginning of the measures pane so it's easier to find.
Hint, this is wrong. That's exactly right. So Esther's right. The calculation is returning valid. That doesn't mean that the values that are returned are going to be correct. So to illustrate that, let's bring this profit ratio calculation to the view. And let's change the number format to percentage. So it looks like New York City has 27,000% profit ratio.
27,101%.
Of course, thank you. So clearly something's wrong. We don't expect a profit ratio over 100% in any case, because you're not going to make more profit than you do sales, of course. So let's create the correct version of this calculated field. Pro tip on this, you guys can drag any pill from the view into a calculation. It'll bring in the aggregation, any table calculations that are applied. So in this case, sum of profit divided by sum of sales. By the way, an aggregation is a function that is used to combine data. So we're using a sum here. The data is broken up into cities. So all the underlying records are grouped into cities. Sum is used to add all those up. Okay, so let's add the correct profit ratio to the view as well. We're hoping to get values under 100% this time, hopefully. Unless we had,
24%.
okay, so more reasonable. So that's promising. But what is different between these two calculations? Why is one right and one wrong? So I'm just going to tell you why, which is that the wrong calculation is the ratio is being computed on a row-by-row basis, and then when it's brought to the view, those ratios are being summed up. For the correct calculation, the sums are being applied up to the view's level of detail, so in this case, city, and then that ratio is taken. So again, this is the comparison between row-by-row level of detail and the view's level of detail. This is important for basically every calculation you create. And so I'm going to explain this one more time with another view. So Esther's going to duplicate this sheet as a crosstab. And we can add a number of records to the view. So this shows that all cities have multiple records associated with them, of course. We can start to filter the view down. It just makes it easier, reduce noise for our troubleshooting. And we can drill down. We can bring in customer name, for example. And now we see, so the profit ratios are a little closer now because there are less records, but they're still not the same. If we brought in product name.
I can find this, I swear.
There we go, down, down, down.
There we go.
Then we can filter on Aaron just to, again, make this thing a little bit easier to see. So now we're seeing that the view has one record associated with each row of the view. That means that the view's level of detail is now equal to the underlying data source detail level, and you can see that because the two calculations are now equal.
So if I wanted to play around with level of detail calculation, what could I do?
So there are a couple of ways to manipulate level of detail in your calculations. The first is with level of detail expressions, aptly named. So for example, in this case, if I wanted to know what Aaron's profit ratio was, his overall profit ratio outside of product name, because right now the view is grouping by product name, customer name, and city, but if we wanted to exclude product name from that grouping, we could use an exclude LOD. And what we'll find, hopefully, when we add grand totals to this view is that
Get mad at me, I have to put it in the view first.
So we're getting 38%. If we add grand totals, we will see that the values match after rounding, of course. So that's good. That's what we were after. So two other kinds of LODs. One is include. So rather than excluding a dimension from an aggregation, you can include it. And finally, fixed level of detail expressions, which are going to exclude all dimensions from the view except for those that you specify. excuse me. Second way that you can manipulate level of detail in calculations is with table calculations. By the way, this stuff, we're touching on a lot of things. It's not important to retain it all. It's just sort of showing what Tableau can do in a lot of ways. So in this simple example, we're going to use a window sum of sales. Table calculations, again, another way to manipulate level of detail. In this case, if we wanted to know the total sales for Aaron across all product names, we could use a calculation like this. And this is, it's nice, these type of calculations are nice because, like if we wanted to calculate percent of total, but couldn't use a table calculation because there are some limitations of table calculations, then we could use something like this as a, oh, I just got a little mixed up. Anyway, we're seeing that the sales total is equal to each row of this window sum of sales, which is what we're after.
So where would we learn more about this?
So yeah, we've covered a lot of topics again, and any of these concepts can be found at tableau.com in our online help. We also have, in the reference guide that we'll be providing on this talk, we have a list of recommended reading. So definitely take a look at that. And on the topic of documentation, not only is Esther a master with analytics, but she's also one of the biggest contributors to our knowledge base and to the online forums. And so you guys will definitely be encountering her work in your future calculation endeavors. But today she is here to bring us a journey. I don't want to give too much away, but there will be woodland creatures, there will be gambling, and there will be Esther breaking stuff. And she's particularly good at breaking things, so you're in good hands.
Thanks, James. Another one of our core cultural values is we are honest, and James is an abundant source of honesty, possibly too honest. Although in tech support, breaking things is actually a valuable job skill, so I consider that a compliment. James covered a lot of topics today. Especially important was the level of detail. Our coverage of these topics today was purposely brief and meant to provide familiarity rather than mastery. But as the title of this section suggests, knowing everything isn't going to be that ace up your sleeve that guarantees your calculations are going to be correct. A lot of the beginners that I've worked with have this concept that experts write calculations like this. Step 1, step 2. With calculations, step 1 would be having an idea of what you want your data to say, and step 2 would be writing out that calculation perfectly the first time. In reality, it's an iterative process where, sneak peek, forget what you saw. I need to stop pushing buttons. In reality, it's an iterative process where you may write one piece, evaluate if that piece is right or wrong. If it's right, you may add on to that until you get to your final end goal. If it's wrong, you need to take a step back and determine why it's wrong. The strength of this iterative process is that it works even when you don't have all the answers, and there are two main reasons for this. The first is that the process itself can help you understand what's going on, so you can actually learn calculations concepts just by playing around with your calculations. The second is that you are now part of the Tableau community, so welcome. We are full of smart and helpful people, so I just wanted to do a brief pause here and kind of go over some of the resources that you have available to you. While you're here at Tableau Conference, there's obviously other sessions, but there's also Tableau Doctor. Has anyone been to Tableau Doctor yet? Oh, some hands, awesome. So for those of you who don't know, Tableau Doctor allows you to schedule a 45-minute appointment to ask any Tableau questions you have, so that's a really great resource, and I recommend everyone stops by. Both James and myself are doctors, and so you might see us if you come say hi. After Tableau Conference, you can always ask your questions on the community forum. We have lots of very smart users as well as Tableau employees who like to answer questions. James already touched on our knowledge base and product help, which has a lot of information, but there's also training videos online. Last but not least, Tableau Technical Support does answer how-to questions, so if you get really stuck, you can submit a support case. I am going to show you my cards. I'm going to show you all 14 steps. You actually saw them, so just forget that. But that next slide is all 14 steps. I know as soon as I bring that up, you're going to want to read it and not listen to me. So I'm going to tell you what you're going to see before I show it to you. You'll notice that all of the steps are numbered, and that's really more of a recommendation or maybe a ranking of how common each step might be for you. Because each calculation is different and the way that we think about calculations is different, you may use different steps for each problem. You may do some steps you don't need, you may skip or repeat steps, and you may do them in a different order. And that's all normal variation for the troubleshooting process. You'll also notice that 14 is a lot of steps. The reason for that is we wanted the list to be exhaustive so you never hit a dead end, and that does cover some edge cases. One last thing, these steps are in our reference guide, so don't feel like you need to write them down, and don't feel like you need to memorize them. The idea is that you'll be able to work through a calculation from the reference guide. And as you work more and more calculations, you'll just start naturally kind of falling into these and remembering them. All right, here they are. They are beautiful. Moving on. So we don't get lost in the 14 steps, I want to give you an idea of kind of the phases that we go through in the troubleshooting process. To start, we're going to simplify the view. And I do say that this is the first thing we want to do because it just makes it easier for us. The fewer things that we have to see and keep in our mind at one time, the easier it is going to be to evaluate the information that's there. Then we're going to want to break the calculation into smaller pieces so that we can determine if each piece is right or wrong. If a piece is right, we can remove that from the view, and so we can just really focus on what's wrong. Finally, we're going to create a view in Tableau that's going to help us discover why a particular piece is returning wrong values. The why here is important because once you know why something is wrong, you know how it needs to change to fix it. So let's poker around in an example, everybody. All right, I love my bad puns. The data I have for you today is poker data, specifically player results from tournaments that happened here in Las Vegas earlier this year. The question I'm asking is, which is the most popular event in each tournament? So I'm going to switch back over to Tableau, and we'll just delete the worksheets that we had before.
Clearly not a visual best practices talk.
That's fair. Our white paper says you only want 7 colors on a dashboard. You'll have to forgive us, though. To create this view with our poker data, I added tournament to the columns shelf, and that makes every bar here one tournament. And then I added the distinct count of players to rows. I chose the distinct count of players because some events allow players to buy back in, and I don't want to count players more than once per event. I then added a quick table calculation of percent of total onto that distinct count of players because I want to be able to compare popularity of events between tournaments. If you aren't familiar with quick table calculations, these are a set of built-in calculations in Tableau that you can apply to any measure. All right, so to make things a little easier, I have copied some of the steps directly into Tableau so we don't have to switch back and forth between PowerPoint. To start out with, we're going to do step 1, which is my favorite step, asking guiding questions. This is a really good one to do or to repeat a lot anytime you get stuck because it can help you generate some ideas of what you need to investigate next. There are 3 guiding questions. The first one is, are these values right? In this case, you may have already noticed what's wrong with these values, but to make it a little bit more obvious, I'm going to add a reference line, which is going to be the total of our distinct count of player. Put the value on there. Oh, not none, I want value. There we go. So now we can see that each of our bars is over 100%. So that means miraculously, more people played in our tournaments, in our events, than attended the tournament. And that seems wrong. These other numbers, though, on the bar segments, I don't know which of these numbers are right or wrong. They could all be a little bit too high, or some of them could be very high, and some of them could be correct. So that's something that we'll need to investigate further. The second question is, how is Tableau computing these values? In this case, I don't know at this point. Because I used the quick table calculation, I don't know what formula Tableau is using to find these results. So that'll be something else we need to investigate. The third question is, how do we want to compute our in view? And so in this case, going into it, I have an answer. The percent of total should be the number of players in each event divided by the number of players in the tournament. You'll notice that the last two questions are kind of two sides of the same poker chip. How is Tableau computing these values? How do I want to compute these values? As we go through our investigation, we want those answers to converge. We also want our answers to become more and more specific until they sound like math problems. And once they get to that point where they sound like math problems, we can just write them out. All right, so to begin, we're going to do, we have some things to investigate. Let's start our simplification phase. We're going to duplicate our view as a crosstab. Some of these steps you'll notice that James did earlier without really touching on them, so that is something that we do as we repeat these steps. To duplicate as a crosstab, we're going to right-click on the Worksheet tab and select Duplicate as Crosstab. Every view in Tableau will show you data in a different way and is better designed for showing different types of trends or letting you see different things. When we're troubleshooting a calculation, what we care about is the exact numeric values and usually comparing these exact numeric values in different circumstances. So a crosstab allows me to more easily scan through these. If we compare this to our original view, all these numbers don't line up, so it's harder for my eye to read them. And some of these bars are so small the numbers don't even show up. I would say, however, that this is not easy to read, so we're going to keep going on the simplification phase. We're going to remove any fields possible, including filters. I call out filters here especially because I've seen a lot of users get very attached to their filters, and we definitely need them in view, but while we're troubleshooting, it's just one more thing we have to think about. So we're going to take it out of the view until we absolutely need it. I also added several fields to the tooltip in my original view, so I'm going to go ahead and pull those out here as well. So it's definitely better. But I'm going to do one more step. I'm going to filter the view to one self-contained example. So what do I mean by self-contained example? In this case, the percent of total is being calculated for each tournament, and that means that one tournament's percent of total cannot possibly affect another tournament's percent of total. So we're safe to filter the view to just one tournament. If I go back to our original view, we want to pick a tournament that has fewer events because it's going to be easier to troubleshoot. So we're going to go with the 2017 January Weekend Extravaganza. Sounds like a fun name. And that is this one. So we're going to keep only. And now we're to a spot where it's really easy to see all the data that we need to look at. You'll notice that these percentages are different than the percentages in the original bar chart. And again, that's just because we took off our filter.
But it is important to note that they still add up to more than 100%.
Right. So as we're troubleshooting, it's good to kind of stop and make sure that the issue is still occurring so we still have something to investigate. So this is what we want to do. We want to go into the phase where we're going to break the calculation into pieces, but we need a calculation to break into pieces first. So for table functions, there's a special step where we can find the formula by dragging the field with the quick table calculation applied into the calculation editor. The count distinctive player is the field with the quick table calculation applied, and I can quickly visually tell that by the triangle delta symbol that's on the field. If I drag that into the calculation editor, Tableau automatically writes out the formula for me. I could also just drag that field into the data pane, and Tableau will create a calculation that I can name. You can never type when people are watching you. All right, I'm going to edit the one that we have saved. So now might be a good time to go back to our guiding questions because we have a little bit more information. Specifically the second question, which is, how is Tableau computing the percent of total? James touched on earlier, I'm not hitting the arrow key, that when we have an aggregation in a calculation, the aggregation is computed at the level of detail in the view. In this case, that means every row in the view, and every row is an event. So our numerator here is the distinct count of players for each event. Our denominator uses the table function total. So what does total do? It returns the total for the given expression. For example, the total average of profit is the average of profit for all database rows that contribute to the partition. So that sounds a little confusing. Essentially what it's saying, because it's a table calculation, we can define the partition. Here, it uses the partition in the view, which is every row, and with total, we can choose which partition. So how do we choose that? Well, if we edit the table calculation, we can see that it's being computed using the specific dimensions event. When you're doing a table calculation, it's important to remember that every dimension in this list here contributes to how the table calculation is computed. Anything that's checked, we are computing along that dimension. Anything that is unchecked, we're computing within that dimension. So we are in the denominator here, we're computing the distinct count of players along event within tournament. For a distinct count, saying that we're computing it along something doesn't really mean anything, so it's kind of saying the same as we're ignoring it, and simply that we're computing within each tournament. So to summarize, Tableau Desktop is computing the percent of total as the distinct count of players for each event divided by the distinct count of players for each tournament. We still have some things to investigate. If you remember our first question, we still don't know if these values are right or wrong, so we're going to dig a little deeper. We are going to add individual expressions from the calculation directly into the view. So I'm going to add the numerator by highlighting the numerator, and then I can click and drag it into the view. And I'll do the same thing for the denominator. This makes our view a little messy again, so I'm going to repeat some of those simplification steps. Or actually, I don't think we've done this one yet. We're going to move fields around in the view to better see all the relevant data. And this seems like a really simple thing, but it can be very powerful in helping you kind of see what's going on. And in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and move measure names to the column shelf so each column is a measure. I'm also going to control drag measure onto color, which adds a copy of measure names onto color. And this is something I personally like to do. It makes it easier to visually distinguish what we're looking at a moment's notice. The green column is our numerator, and the red column is our denominator. And you'll notice that now our denominator is returning the same values as our numerator, which is clearly wrong. So we have another special step for table calculations to keep in mind anytime you're using a table calculation, and that is that we need to ensure that the table calculations are using the same compute using settings. So if you remember, in our original calculation, we were computing total using the specific dimensions event. Now we've pulled total outside of that original calculation into its own calculation. We want to make sure we're still computing it the same way. So if we go into the Edit Table Calculation dialog, we see that by default, Tableau is computing it table across, which means we're computing it for each event. Instead, let's go ahead and just copy what it was in the original calculation. And now our denominator is 25. And that seems much more reasonable that we would have 25 total players in our tournament. At this point, we can do a little verification on the numbers we're seeing to dig deeper into why they're right or wrong. And I gave up on mental math in college, so I'm going to pull up a calculator. The first thing I want to check is that 16% actually 4 divided by 25. And it is. So that Tableau is doing the math right, which I would expect it to. The next thing I want to check is that all of the players that attended each event add up to all of the players in the tournament. So that is 4 plus 5 plus 3 plus 6 plus 5 plus 4 plus 2. 29. So 29 is obviously not 25. We have 4 mysterious players that we don't know why Tableau is not including in the denominator. So we'll need to do some additional investigation on that. And to do that, we're going to break this calculation down even further. We're going to add the aggregated dimension to the view as a dimension. So in this calculation, the aggregated dimension is player. We're aggregating it in the numerator with count distinct and in the denominator by total count distinct. I'm going to highlight player and drag it to rows. I'm doing it, I'm adding every player. So 25 is not, or 29 is not a lot of players, so it's not terrible here. And I can now see that these are real people, that they have names, that they're not something Tableau made up. And I kind of remember that our first event had 4 players, but I'm just gonna make things really easy on myself. I'm gonna duplicate the view and take player out, and I'm just gonna throw these both onto a quick dashboard so we can compare them side by side. So we can see our first event has 4 players here if we count them up manually, and that matches 4 here. Our second event has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 players, which manually counted up, which matches the 5 that Tableau is giving us for our numerator. So now I believe that Tableau is giving us the correct values for our numerator. I believe these numbers are right. But I still don't know why Tableau is giving me 25 for our denominator and not 29. So I'm going to repeat a couple of steps that we did before. Now that we have player in the view, our original calculation is kind of giving us nonsense. It's saying that every player is 100% of itself. So I'm just going to take that out because that's not helping us. And I'm going to move things around actually. So that's kind of good. I think I'd rather, no, I liked it better the other way. So I'm going to tighten this up a little bit too so it's easier to see everything at a glance. So here every column is an event and every row is a player. Our numerator is giving us a 1 if that player attended an event, and our denominator is giving us a 1 for every player. We manually counted up players to kind of verify numbers, and that's okay because we don't have a lot of players, but another way that we could do that is we can add our totals, column totals, and I'm going to move these to the top. And whenever you're adding totals to your view for verification purposes, I always recommend changing it from automatic totals to sum totals, and that just guarantees that it's going to sum up the values as you see them in the view. In this case, there was no difference, but it's something you want to keep in mind. And here we see that our totals for each event match what we were seeing before, and it's saying that our totals for all the players in the tournament is 25, even though we know that if we add these all up, we get 29. Another way we could kind of verify this, at the bottom of Tableau, it tells us how many rows we have in the view, and we have 26 rows, so that's 25 players plus the grand total row. So there actually are just 25 named players here. And you may be able to see what's going on in this view, but I also put it into my PowerPoint presentation because I wanted to use the fancy boxes. Oh, I have the wrong one up. And now I closed it. I appreciate your patience, guys. These boxes will be worth it. Okay, so to recap, we have 25 players. We can see all 25 of their names there. They are real people. There's not 4 extra people that Tableau forgot to count in the denominator. In each event, Tableau is correctly summing up the number of people who went to that event. However, there are 4 people who went to 2 events. Another way that you might look at this, if you are more into the visual bar charts, is you could create a bar chart of number of events per player, and that would also show you that there are 4 players per event. At this point, we can go back to Tableau, and we can kind of answer that second question again, how is Tableau computing the values that we see in the view? Tableau is giving us the distinct count of players for each event, divided by distinct count of players for the tournament, and it's not counting people twice if they went to another event. We might want to stop and ask our third question as well. How do we want to compute the percent of total? Now that we know what Tableau is doing, and it's technically right, we know that this view is giving us 2 pieces of information. It's telling us which events. I bet you guys want to see Tableau. on-the-fly troubleshooting here. Do you remember how to do this? Oh, multiple displays, clone display.
You need to duplicate, that way we see your screen.
I'm sorry, say again?
Change it from multiple displays to duplicate, that way we see what you're seeing.
Oh, apply. There we go. That's the button I was missing. All right. I don't know why it decided to break in the middle of our presentation, or why the screen decided to turn off.
That's probably me.
So now that we know how Tableau Desktop is computing the percent of total for our count distinct, oh, yes, you're right. Apply, yes. All right. So the second thing I've been trying to say 3 times, and the computer keeps stopping me, is that the overall percentage is now telling us what percentage of people attended multiple events. So in our example tournament, the 2017 January weekend extravaganza, we had 4.17% of players attend multiple events. And that could be information that you want to show your users. However, if you do want to have all of your bars be 100%, essentially count people twice in the denominator if they attended multiple events, we can do that as well. So going back to this view, we want to make our question, our answer to that question, as specific as possible and sound like a math problem. So instead of 4 divided by 25, we want 4 divided by 29, where 29 is the sum of all of the distinct counts that we see in the view. I'm going to open up our calculation here. So earlier, James already showed us a function that would sum up the values as we see them in the view, and that is window sum. If we hit apply, that changes our calculation, and I like to manually verify, so I'm going to open up the calculator again really quickly. 4 divided by 29 is indeed 13.79%. So that's now returning the numbers that we're expecting. If we go back to our original view, we can pop that percent of total onto the row shelf, and we can also put that onto label. And now we see that all of our bars are at this 100% mark, and all of our bar segments are showing slightly smaller percentages. James used the word journey before, and we have been on quite a journey to get to this final view. We had to first discover what our calculation was by dragging the field with the calculation, the quick table calculation applied, into the calculation editor. Then we had to break that calculation into pieces, the numerator and the denominator, to determine which piece was giving us the problem. We had to add more detail to the view. In this case, that was the dimension player, so that we could discover why the denominator was not what we expected it to be. In this particular example, we even had to reevaluate what we wanted from the graph to decide what the final version was going to look like before we finally got to the point in the calculation where we changed the function total to the function window sum. That last piece, where you know what function you need to change it to, might not be one that you know right away, but this process is still useful because it helps you have a better question. Instead of saying, hey, my graph is wrong and I don't know why, you're saying, hey, I need a function that'll add up the values as I see them in the view. And that's a much easier question to get an answer for, or potentially to find search terms for when you're searching on the Tableau website. All right, want to come back up?
Yeah. So as you guys are cashing out, think about some of the concepts we talked about today that struck a chord with you. And for anyone who wants to stick around for questions, I'm not sure how much time we have now, but
Technically 0 time, but we'll hang out back a little bit.
yeah. So you're not going to hurt our feelings. You guys can leave at any time. Anyone who wants to stay and ask a question, feel free.
Don't forget to fill out your surveys. Enjoy conference.